There are two kinds of silence. There's the kind that heals you, the deep, peaceful quiet that settles into your bones and tells you that all is right with the world. And then there's the other kind, the silence that holds its breath, waiting for something to break it. For 3 years after my wife Eleanor passed, this porch swing overlooking Azure Lake had only offered the first kind. It was my sanctuary. Here, with a warm mug of coffee in my hands and the scent of the pine trees she'd planted, the world still made sense. The gentle lapping of the water against the shore was the only clock I needed. The quiet was a conversation I had with her memory. It was sacred. That ordinary Saturday morning, the silence held its breath, and then it broke. It wasn't a loud noise. It was a crunch, the sound of tires rolling over the gravel of my long driveway, slow and deliberate. It was a sound that didn't belong. My neighbors knew to call first. The mail carrier came before noon. Anyone else was usually lost. I stayed seated, my hand resting on my warm mug. From my vantage point on the porch, I could see the end of the driveway where it met the county road. A black sedan, unremarkable in every way, came into view. It crept forward like a predator casing its territory. And then I saw it. A cheap, stick-on bar of blue and red lights on the roof began to flash, a pathetic, silent imitation of real authority. My body didn't tense, but a different kind of alert settled over me. The kind I'd felt for 30 years on the bench when a witness's story didn't quite add up. Something was wrong, deeply and fundamentally wrong. The car stopped. The flashing lights painted garish strokes on the old oak tree that Eleanor had loved. For a moment nothing happened. Then 2 doors opened and 2 men stepped out. They were dressed in what was meant to look like a county sheriff's uniform. But my mind, trained to notice discrepancies, began cataloguing the errors immediately. The khaki shirts were a shade too light. The trousers were off the rack, not the heavy twill of standard issue. The man on the passenger side had a gun belt, but the holster was a cheap nylon thing, and the pistol grip I could see looked suspiciously like molded plastic. But the biggest tell was their posture. They walked with a swagger that wasn't earned. It was a performance. They weren't lawmen. They were playing dress-up. The taller of the two, the one with the plastic-looking gun, strode forward until he was at the foot of my porch steps. He stopped, planting his feet wide, a caricature of authority. "Mr. Vance," he said. His voice tried for deep and commanding, but came out thin. "Arthur Vance!" I took a slow sip of my coffee before answering, letting him wait. "I am," I said, my voice even. "Sir, we're with the County Enforcement Division," he announced. "We have a verbal order from the court. You're instructed to immediately dismantle the fence line along the northern edge of your property." I looked at him, then at his partner, who was lingering nervously by the car. A verbal order from the court. It was so brazen, so utterly laughably amateur that I almost felt a flicker of pity for them. Almost. Instead of anger, a cold, clear focus settled over me. The same focus I felt just before delivering a sentence. These men weren't the source of the problem. They were symptoms. Tools sent by someone who had mistaken my quiet life for a weak one. I knew exactly who. Cynthia Davenport and her obsessive homeowners association. This was the culmination of months of petty letters and passive-aggressive notices. The fence they mentioned was a simple, rustic, split-rail fence that had been on this property since my father's time. To the Oakhaven estates, with their manicured lawns and identical mailboxes, it was an eyesore. To me, it was a boundary, a line between my world and theirs, and they had just sent armed men, or a poor imitation of them, to force me to erase it. I set my coffee mug down on the small table beside me with a soft click. The sound seemed to echo in the sudden stillness. "County Enforcement Division," I repeated slowly, letting the words hang in the air. "I'm not familiar with that division, and I've been working with the county for a very long time." I let my eyes drift over the taller man's uniform again. "Interesting badge you have there. What's your name, son? And your badge number?" The man's bravado flickered. A flash of uncertainty crossed his face. Sir, we don't need to— Oh, but you do, I interrupted, my voice still quiet, but now with an edge of steel that had made hardened criminals squirm in my courtroom. When an officer of the law, or someone pretending to be one, gives a citizen an order, that citizen has every right to verify their credentials. So again, your name, your badge number, and while you're at it, which judge issued this verbal order? His partner by the car shifted his weight, taking a half step back. The first man swallowed hard. He was out of his depth. The script he'd been given hadn't prepared him for this. It was time to end the charade. I pushed myself up from the porch swing, slowly unfolding to my full height. I am not a small man, and as I stood, I felt the familiar weight of my own authority settle back onto my shoulders. An authority that didn't come from a cheap costume, but from a lifetime of service and a deep understanding of the law they were so clumsily trying to mimic. "Let me save you both some trouble," I said, my voice now devoid of any warmth. It was the voice I used for sentencing. "My name is Judge Arthur Vance. I preside over the Superior Court of this county, the very court you claim to represent." I watched the color drain from the man's face. His jaw went slack. His eyes, for the first time, showed genuine fear. Not fear of me, but fear of a catastrophic miscalculation. He finally understood. "I can assure you," I continued, taking a step toward the edge of the porch, "that no such order exists. And I know for a fact that impersonating a law enforcement officer is a felony in this state." I pulled my phone from my pocket. "You have 30 seconds to get in your ridiculous car and disappear from my property. After that, this phone call will not be to report a crime." I paused, letting the final words land with the weight of a gavel. "It will be to set a consequence in motion." They didn't need the full 30 seconds. They scrambled back into the sedan, a clumsy, panicked retreat. The car kicked up a cloud of gravel as it reversed wildly and sped down the driveway, the silly lights on the roof still flashing. I watched them go, a single thought crystallizing in my mind. This was not the end. This was the beginning of the end for them. The dust settled, the silence returned, but it was different now. It was the silence of a battlefield after the first shot has been fired. I raised my phone to my ear, the screen already lit with a familiar name. My first call wasn't to 911. It was to a man who understood, as I did, that some lines should never, ever be crossed. The phone rang once, twice, a familiar digital pulse cutting through the sudden quiet. In those few seconds of waiting for my friend, Sheriff Pat O'Connell, to answer, my mind, unbidden, rewound the clock. Not just minutes, but months. It sifted through the sequence of events, the chain of grievances and aggressions that had led to this moment, to hired thugs in bad costumes standing on the sacred ground of my driveway. It all felt so far removed from the life Eleanor and I had built here. This land wasn't just property to me. It was a living testament to a shared love. When we first bought this plot 35 years ago, it was nothing but wild shoreline and a tangle of overgrown woods. Eleanor saw its soul. She was the one who designed the house, with its wide porch facing the lake so we could watch the storms roll in. She planted the rambling rose bushes that now climbed the porch columns, their scent on a summer evening, a ghost of her perfume. I handled the heavy work, clearing the land, building the stone walls by hand, but she was the architect of our peace. After she was gone, the silence she left behind was immense. But it wasn't an empty silence. It was filled with her. Her presence was in the worn spot on the porch swing where she always sat, in the dog-eared books still on the shelves, in the way the morning light hit the kitchen table. This place wasn't a house. It was the last tangible piece of our life together. It was my sanctuary. And then, across the cove, Oak Haven Estates began to rise. At first it was just the noise of construction. Then came the houses themselves, enormous sterile structures, each one a slight variation of the next, packed together like expensive sardines. Their lawns were unnaturally green, their flower beds aggressively manicured, They built a towering clubhouse and a gatehouse with a uniformed guard. They weren't building a community. They were building a fortress against anything that felt too real, too natural. My property, with its native grasses, its slightly crooked split-rail fence, and its unapologetic wildness, was a stark contrast. I was a holdover from a time before their rules and regulations, an untamed spot at the edge of their perfect picture. The first ripple in my quiet lake arrived by mail. It was a thick, cream-colored envelope embossed with the Oakhaven Estates Homeowners Association logo, an oak leaf strangled by a perfect circle. The letter inside was polite in that cloying, condescending way that signals the exact opposite. It was signed by Cynthia Davenport, President. I'd seen her once or twice at the local market. A woman in her late 50s, with a helmet of perfectly styled blonde hair and a porcelain smile that never quite reached her eyes. She radiated a chilly, relentless energy, the kind of person who believes their opinions are facts. The letter informed me that my fence, the one my father and I had put up decades ago, was not in keeping with the aesthetic standards of the surrounding community. It suggested I replace it with a more appropriate white vinyl alternative. I remember chuckling as I read it. The arrogance was breathtaking. My property wasn't part of her association. Her rules had as much authority over my land as the King of England. So, I responded, not as a neighbor, but as I would to a poorly drafted legal motion. I wrote a short, polite letter back, citing the county property statutes, the exact boundary lines from the official survey, and the legal precedent protecting a private landowner's right to, well, own their own land. I photocopied the relevant sections from the county code book for her convenience. I signed it, sent it, and assumed that a clear, logical, and legally sound argument would be the end of it. That was my first miscalculation. I had assumed I was dealing with a rational person. Cynthia Davenport's response was not rational. A week later, another letter arrived. This one was sharper in tone. It ignored my legal points entirely and instead spoke of community harmony and my responsibility to my neighbors. It was followed by another, this one concerning the native cattails and milkweed I allowed to grow by the shoreline to support the monarch butterflies Eleanor had so loved. Apparently they were unmanaged growth and a potential fire hazard. It was then I realized this wasn't about a fence or some weeds. This was about control. My quiet, self-contained world was an affront to her need for total uniformity. I was a loose thread on a perfectly woven tapestry, and she was determined to either pull me into line or snip me off completely. The paper storm began in earnest. I started receiving official-looking notices with bold, alarming headings. Final notice of aesthetic violation. Community harmony compliance warning. They were masterpieces of bureaucratic intimidation, designed to scare an average person into submission. They had no legal weight, of course, but they were relentless. That's when I opened a new manila folder in the bottom drawer of my study desk. I wrote on the tab, in my neatest hand, Oakhaven versus Sanity. Inside, I placed every letter, every notice, every envelope, each one dated and logged. It's a habit from my years on the bench. Document everything. A solid case is built on a foundation of irrefutable fact. I didn't know what kind of case I was building yet, but I knew I would need it. When the letters failed to break my resolve, Cynthia escalated. She took the battle public, or at least as public as her gated community's online forum. It was my neighbor Bob from down the road who told me about it. He's a good man, a retired engineer who valued his privacy as much as I did. He'd shown up at my door one afternoon, his face grim, holding his tablet. "Arthur, I think you need to see this," he'd said. He showed me the posts. There I was, my name attached to accusations of being a reclusive and uncooperative neighbor. My land was described as a blighted stretch of wilderness that was single-handedly dragging down property values. There were comments from other residents, people I'd never even met, calling me selfish, calling my property an eyesore. Cynthia herself had written a long, self-righteous post about the importance of shared sacrifice for the greater good. It was a classic poisoning of the well, a tactic used by desperate lawyers to turn a jury against a defendant before the trial even begins. She was trying to isolate me, to paint me as the villain in her carefully crafted narrative. My response was silence. Engaging in an online squabble was a battle I would not win and would not honor with my participation. My silence, I suspect, infuriated her even more. The final stage before today's fiasco began about a month ago. That's when I first noticed the black sedan. It would cruise slowly down the county road past my driveway, sometimes stopping for a moment before moving on. There was no reason for it to be there. I took down the license plate, an old habit. I ran it through a public records search I have access to. It was registered to a private security firm in the city, a firm with a spotty record, known for hiring aggressive ex-military types for asset protection and union busting. My blood ran cold when I saw that. This was a significant escalation. The game had changed. Cynthia Davenport was no longer content to fight with paper and poison pens. She was preparing to bring the fight to my front door. She was researching. She was planning. She was moving from harassment to intimidation. The sound of a powerful engine, a Ford V8 I knew as well as my own, pulled me from my thoughts. The deep familiar rumble of the sheriff's department cruiser grew louder, a welcome sound in the unnerving quiet. Pat was here. The black sedan had been a warning. The two men in their ridiculous costumes had been the attack. Cynthia Davenport had spent months trying to bury me in paper and poison me with lies, thinking I was just a stubborn old man. She thought she was escalating the fight. She had no idea. Standing there on my desecrated driveway, I knew the time for patient documentation was over. The file I had so meticulously built was no longer a shield. It was about to become a sword. Pat O'Connell shut his cruiser door, and the solid, authoritative thud seemed to reclaim the territory that had been violated just minutes before. He was a big man, built like the retired linebacker he was, with a face weathered by decades of Idaho sun and human folly. We'd been friends since our sons played on the same Little League team 30 years ago. We didn't need many words. He surveyed the scene, the tire tracks gouged into my gravel, the lingering dust in the air. His eyes, a pale, piercing blue, met mine. "Arthur," was all he said, a question and a statement in one. "Pat," I nodded back. I gave him the license plate number I'd memorized weeks ago, reciting it from memory. I described the two men, their cheap uniforms, the plastic-looking sidearm. I told him about the verbal order from the court. Pat listened without interrupting, his expression hardening with each detail. He ran a large hand over his crew cut. When I finished, he was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the entrance to Oak Haven Estates across the cove, as if he could see Cynthia Davenport's perfect house from here. "Impersonating an officer," he finally said, his voice a low rumble. "A felony. On a sitting judge's property, the sheer unmitigated stupidity. It's breathtaking." He shook his head, not in disbelief, but in a kind of weary disgust. "Some people think a gated community makes them a sovereign nation." "This one thinks she's a queen," I corrected quietly. "Well," Pat said, turning back to me, a cold fire in his eyes now, "her reign is about to have a very bad day." He clapped me on the shoulder, a solid, reassuring gesture. "I'll handle this, Arthur. Go make some more coffee. I'll be in touch before the end of the day." He didn't need to say more. I knew what handling it meant for Pat O'Connell. It meant swift, professional, and thorough action. As he drove away, I felt the last of the morning's violation begin to recede, replaced by a cold, clear sense of purpose. The sword I had forged in my study was about to be drawn. Monday morning, for the first time in months, I put on a suit and tie. The familiar weight of the tweed jacket and the knot of the silk tie felt like armor. I wasn't going to my old courtroom to preside. I was going to the county courthouse to present a case. My destination was the office of the district attorney. Evelyn Reed was a whip-smart lawyer in her early 40s, a woman I had personally sworn in when she won her election. She had been one of the sharpest prosecutors in the state, and now she ran the DA's office with a no-nonsense efficiency that had made her both respected and feared. She greeted me not with formality, but with genuine concern. "Arthur," Pat told me the broad strokes. "Are you all right?" she asked, ushering me into her office. "I'm fine, Evelyn," I said, taking a seat opposite her large mahogany desk. "But I'm here today not just as a friend or a victim. I'm here as the primary witness to a series of escalating crimes." From my leather briefcase, I withdrew the manila folder, the one labeled Oak Haven versus Sanity. I placed it squarely in the center of her desk. "It started with this," I began, laying out the first letter from Cynthia Davenport, then the next. I walked her through the entire campaign, piece by piece, the increasingly aggressive notices laminated as if to give them a false sense of permanence, the printouts of the online forum with the relevant posts highlighted, the timeline I had meticulously kept, the photo I had taken of the black sedan's license plate weeks ago, and finally my own written, signed, and dated account of the incident on Saturday morning. Evelyn listened, her expression shifting from concern to professional focus, and finally to a state of cold, controlled fury. She picked up one of the laminated notice of aesthetic violation sheets, turning it over in her hands as if it were a piece of contaminated evidence. "This is incredible," she murmured, shaking her head. "The arrogance to put all of this in writing. Criminals often have an inflated sense of their own intelligence," I noted. "This isn't just harassment, Arthur," she said, her eyes meeting mine across the desk. Her voice was firm, all business now. "This is a textbook pattern of coercion and intimidation. The impersonation charge is the felony that gets our foot in the door, but looking at this file, I'm seeing conspiracy. I'm seeing potential wire fraud if they use their community website to organize this. This is far bigger than a neighborhood dispute." She leaned forward. "Give me 48 hours, she said. "I'll get my best investigator on it. Pat has already made significant headway. Let's see how deep this rabbit hole goes." I left her office feeling a profound sense of gravity. I had just set in motion a machine that I knew better than most could be relentless and unforgiving. I had done so without hesitation. Cynthia Davenport had mistaken my desire for peace as a weakness to be exploited. She was about to learn that true strength isn't loud. It's methodical. The dominoes began to fall faster than I had anticipated. Pat called me that evening. "We found the security firm, Arthur, a fly-by-night outfit in a strip mall downtown called Vanguard Protection Solutions. The name is bigger than the whole operation." He told me the owner had crumbled the moment 2 uniformed deputies and a detective walked into his office. He swore he had no idea his men were impersonating officers. He claimed the contract was just for property observation and verbal deterrence. But when faced with the possibility of losing his business license and facing conspiracy charges, he gave them everything: the names of the 2 employees, their work schedules, and a copy of the contract. The contract was signed by Cynthia Davenport on behalf of the Oak Haven Estates HOA. The next day, the 2 officers were brought in for questioning. As I had suspected, they weren't hardened criminals. They were low-wage employees trying to make a living who had been convinced by their boss and a substantial cash bonus that what they were doing was in a legal gray area. Faced with a felony charge, they sang like a badly rehearsed choir. They described the meeting where Cynthia Davenport herself had briefed them. They said she'd called Judge Vance a stubborn old relic who needed to be shaken up a bit. She had personally inspected their uniforms and told them to use the phrase verbal order from the court, believing the legal-sounding jargon would intimidate me into compliance. The final piece of the puzzle, the one that would seal the entire case, came from Evelyn's office on Wednesday. Her investigators, armed with a warrant, had subpoenaed the financial records of the Oakhaven HOA, and there it was, in black and white. A wire transfer for $5,000 from the HOA's primary operating account to Vanguard Protection Solutions, dated the Thursday before the incident. The authorization for the transfer, a digital document requiring a board member's approval, was signed with a crisp digital signature, Cynthia M. Davenport, President. She hadn't even bothered to hide it. She had used community funds to hire fake police to intimidate a judge, and she had signed her own name to it. The sheer, unadulterated hubris of it was, as Pat had said, breathtaking. Evelyn called me late Thursday afternoon. Her voice was tight with grim satisfaction. "We have everything, Arthur," she said. "The sworn statements from the employees. The owner of the security firm is cooperating fully, and we have the money trail, clean and direct. There are no holes in this. It's an ironclad case." I was silent for a moment, absorbing the finality of it. "What's the next step?" I asked, though I already knew. "The next step," Evelyn said, "is a warrant. It's being signed by a judge from the next county over as we speak, to avoid any appearance of conflict. We're picking her up in the morning, at her home." I ended the call and walked out onto my porch. The sun was setting over the lake, casting long shadows across the water. I thought about Cynthia Davenport, in her perfect house, in her perfect community, sipping a glass of wine, completely unaware that her world was about to be turned upside down. She was about to receive a visit from some real officers of the law. The irony was as deep and cold as the lake in winter. I didn't need to watch it happen. I didn't need to see the flashing lights of real sheriff's cruisers glinting off the perfectly polished windows of Cynthia Davenport's home. But I was awake. I sat on my porch as the sun began its slow ascent, the sky turning from bruised purple to a soft, hopeful rose. My coffee grew cold in my hand. From across the cove, through the powerful binoculars I kept for birdwatching, I could see the entrance to Oakhaven Estates. It was just as Pat and Evelyn had said. At precisely 7 a.m., 2 county cruisers pulled up to the ornate iron gates. They didn't wait for the guard. One of the deputies stepped out with a remote and the gates swung open, a courtesy I knew was reserved for law enforcement. They drove in without haste. They were not there to create a scene. They were there to execute a warrant. A few minutes later, they re-emerged. Between them was a figure, small, diminished, without her usual armor of tailored blazers and confident posture. Even from this distance, I could feel the collapse of her world. The bubble of privilege and untouchability she had so carefully constructed had just been pierced by the simple, sharp point of the law. There is no satisfaction in witnessing a person's downfall, no matter how deserved. There is only a grim affirmation that the scales of justice, though they may grind slowly and at times seem to tilt, do in the end find their balance. I lowered the binoculars and went inside to pour myself a fresh cup of coffee. The waiting was over. The consequences had begun. I made a deliberate choice not to attend the preliminary hearing later that week. It would have been improper. My presence in the courtroom, even as a spectator, could have been misconstrued as an attempt to influence the proceedings. Justice needed not only to be done, but to be seen to be done, free of any hint of personal vengeance. I trusted Evelyn. I trusted the system I had served my whole life. The call from Evelyn came on Friday afternoon. I was in my workshop, sanding down a piece of driftwood I'd found on the shore, the rhythmic work calming my mind. I saw her name on the screen and wiped the sawdust from my hands before answering. "It's done, Arthur," she said, her voice crisp and professional, but with an undercurrent of profound satisfaction. "Tell me," I said simply, sitting down on a nearby stool. "It was a route," she began. "Her lawyer was a high-priced hotshot from the city." He tried to paint the whole thing as a simple neighborhood misunderstanding that had spun out of control. He called the impersonation incident a regrettable but overzealous action by a third-party contractor. I could almost hear her shake her head over the phone. "The judge, a woman I know you respect, didn't buy it for a second. When I presented the file, your file, Arthur, and walked the court through the systematic campaign of harassment, the forged-looking notices, the online smear campaign, you could feel the atmosphere in the room change. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a persecution. She took a breath. And then we got to the main event. We had the sworn testimony of the two men who identified Cynthia in a photo lineup. We had the confession from the security firm's owner, and we had the financial records, the wire transfer, when the prosecutor displayed the transaction on the overhead screen with her digital signature clear as day. Her lawyer just quietly sat down. There was nothing left to say. What were the charges? I asked. Conspiracy to commit a felony, 2 counts of impersonating a law enforcement officer, witness intimidation, and wire fraud for using HOA funds to facilitate a crime. The list is long, Arthur. She's facing serious time. And bail? Bail was set at $250,000, Evelyn said. She looked like she'd been struck by lightning. Her attorney argued for a lower amount, but the judge cited her access to significant funds and the calculated, malicious nature of her actions. He called her a potential danger to the community and a flight risk. She won't be planning any neighborhood beautification projects for a while. We spoke for a few more minutes, going over the next steps, but the heart of the matter was settled. The legal machine I had set in motion had done its work. I hung up the phone and looked around my quiet workshop at the familiar tools and the scent of cedar and sawdust. A weight I hadn't fully realized I was carrying had been lifted. The news of Cynthia Davenport's arrest and the subsequent hearing spread through the county like wildfire. The story was too juicy to ignore. A powerful HOA president arrested for hiring fake cops to intimidate a sitting judge. It made the local paper, then a regional news blog. The fallout in Oak Haven Estates was, as my neighbor Bob later told me, apocalyptic. An emergency board meeting was called. It descended into a shouting match. 2 board members resigned on the spot, terrified of being implicated in a conspiracy. The HOA's legal counsel informed them that their insurance would not cover criminal activity, meaning they were personally on the hook for the massive legal fees to defend Cynthia. Not to mention the civil lawsuits that were sure to follow. The state's Financial Oversight Board launched a full-scale audit of the HOA's books, prompted by the evidence of misused funds. The pristine facade of Oak Haven Estates had cracked, revealing something rotten at its core. The big welcoming sign at their gated entrance, carved from expensive redwood, no longer seemed to represent exclusivity and prestige. It now stood as a monument to arrogance and disgrace. I thought that was the end of it. Justice served. The legal battle won. The quiet I had fought for was finally restored. I spent the next few weeks simply being. I worked in my garden. I took my small boat out on the lake. I sat on the porch and watched the eagles hunt for fish, feeling the rhythm of my life slowly return to normal. I thought the story was over. But one evening, about a month after the hearing, as the sun was bleeding orange and purple across the sky, I saw something new. A small group of people, 3 of them, were walking up my long gravel driveway. They walked slowly, hesitantly. They weren't carrying weapons or fake badges. They were carrying the heavy weight of a difficult conversation. I stood up from the porch swing, a sigh escaping my lips. This story, I realized, still had one more chapter left to write. I stood up from the porch swing as the 3 of them came to a stop at the bottom of my steps. The man in the middle was Bob, my neighbor from down the road, the one who had shown me the online forum posts. The other 2, a man and a woman, looked vaguely familiar, but I couldn't place their names. They weren't dressed for a confrontation. They were dressed in the simple, casual clothes of a Saturday evening at home. They looked like what they were, ordinary people caught in the wreckage of an extraordinary mess. No one spoke for a moment. They looked at the porch steps, at the climbing roses, at the lake behind me, anywhere but directly at me. It was Bob who finally cleared his throat and broke the silence. "Judge Vance, Arthur," he began. his voice hesitant. We came here to apologize." He looked to the others for support, and the woman nodded, giving him the courage to continue. "What Cynthia did was wrong, in every possible way, but we were wrong too. We were the board members who let her do it. We sat in those meetings, we heard her rhetoric, we saw the rules get stricter, the letters get nastier, and we stayed quiet. We were cowards," the other man added, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was easier to just let Cynthia have her way than to stand up to her. We didn't realize, we never thought it would go this far. And for our silence, and for what it cost you, we are truly, deeply sorry." I listened. My arms crossed over my chest. I heard the shame in their voices, the genuine regret. I had seen countless apologies in my courtroom over the years. I knew the difference between a performance for the judge and a true reckoning with one's own failures. This was the latter. I let the silence stretch for a long moment after they finished, letting their words settle. Vengeance would have been easy. A few sharp, cutting remarks to send them away with their tails between their legs. But what would that accomplish? They were already beaten. "The rules you lived by were the problem," I said finally, my voice calm and measured. "Cynthia Davenport didn't create that environment from nothing. She built her throne on a foundation of fear and apathy that was already there. She was the symptom, not the disease." I looked at each of them in turn. "The disease is a community that values conformity over character and control over freedom. You didn't just let her harass me. You let her diminish your own community, one petty rule at a time." Bob nodded, his gaze fixed on the floor. "We know, and now we don't know what to do. The HOA is bankrupt. The state is investigating. Most of the residents are either angry or scared. The place is falling apart." He finally looked up at me, his eyes pleading. "We were hoping, we were wondering if you might help us, tell us how to fix it." I had not expected that. I had expected an apology, perhaps a request for me to drop any potential civil suits, but a request for guidance? That was something else entirely. It was an admission not just of fault, but of helplessness. I thought of Eleanor. She believed in second chances. She believed that any garden, no matter how overgrown with weeds, could be reclaimed with patience and hard work. "I will not be your new president," I said firmly. "I will not run your association. This community must learn to govern itself." Their faces fell. "But," I continued, "I will offer my counsel. If you are serious about drafting a new set of bylaws that are fair, legal, and based on the simple principle of respecting your neighbor's rights and property, then I will review them. I will offer my legal opinion to ensure you are building on a foundation of rock this time, not sand." A wave of palpable relief washed over them. It was more than they had hoped for. It was a path forward. "Thank you, Judge," the woman said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." We talked for a little while longer, standing there in the twilight. We talked about property lines and common areas, about reasonable standards, and the importance of dissent. When they left, they walked not with the hesitancy they had arrived with, but with a new sense of purpose. Over the next few months, something remarkable happened. The Oakhaven Estates HOA was formally dissolved, and in its place, a new, simpler lakeside neighborhood cooperative was formed. Guided by our discussions, they drafted a one-page document of basic principles. No more rules about the color of mailboxes or the height of sunflowers. Just simple agreements about shared roads and shoreline preservation. The big imposing sign at the entrance came down. The guardhouse was repurposed into a community library and toolshare shed. The online forum, once a hotbed of gossip and complaint, became a place where people organized potlucks and offered to help elderly neighbors with their yard work. The fear was gone, replaced by a tentative but growing sense of real community. And now I sit here on my porch swing once more. It is autumn. The air is crisp, and the leaves on the oaks are turning to golden rust. The lake is calm, a vast expanse of deep blue under a clear sky. The silence has returned. Not the tense waiting silence, but the healing kind. The kind Eleanor loved. The folder labeled Oak Haven versus Sanity was burned to ash in my fireplace weeks ago. Cynthia Davenport took a plea bargain and is serving a sentence in a state facility. Her name now a cautionary tale. She tried to steal my peace with a parody of the law, a cheap imitation of power. She sought to control a world she did not understand, to pave over a sanctuary she could not appreciate. She forgot that a man's home is his castle, and that the foundations of this one were laid with love and fortified by memory. She brought a war to my doorstep, thinking she was attacking a feeble old man. She never realized she was marching her toy soldiers straight into the crosshairs of the law itself. And I was the law.